Hi boys and girls, and welcome to another E20. Erin and I are up in her bedroom today and we're sitting here in front of her bookcase full of all her lovely books. We love reading books, don't we? Yeah. And one of Erin's favourite books is this one, The Chicken Thief. And it's about a wolf who jumps out of the long grass and steals a chicken. But all he wants is to be the chicken's friend, and at the end the chicken decides that she's going to stay with the wolf or the fox forever, isn't she? And they live happily ever after. But boys and girls, the thing is, most of the stories in Erin's bookshelf are not real. They're just made up for us to enjoy and to have fun listening to. But today I'm going to read you two stories. And the thing that's so good about these stories is that they are real. They really, really, really happened because these are stories from the Bible. So I'm going to read you two stories from the Bible, and I love that these stories are not just for fun, but they are real stories that actually truly happened. So the first story we're going to read is a story about a man called Joshua. So let me read it to you. It's from the Jesus Storybook Bible, and this one's called The Warrior Leader. After Moses died, God gave his people a new leader. His name was Joshua, which means the Lord saves. Joshua was going to lead God's people into the special land God had promised to give them. By this time, God's people had been wandering around in that baking desert for 40 years. So you can imagine how sick they were of sand and anything yellow, and tents and walking and being hot. And how happy they were to reach the edge of the desert and to see their beautiful new home right there in front of them, all cool and green and lovely. There was only one problem: Jericho. Jericho was a city, but it wasn't just any old city. It was a fortress, and it stopped anyone from getting into the land. The people looked at Jericho, at the big, giant, scary walls around it, at the tall, towering ramparts, at the heavy iron gates bolted shut, at each other. What would they do? No one knew. But God knew, and God told Joshua what to do. But Joshua must have looked surprised because it was a very odd battle plan indeed, as we'll soon find out. Then God made his people a promise. I will always be with you, and I will never, ever leave you. If you do what I say, your lives in the new land will be happy and everything will go well. So Joshua gathered his army together. They had their swords and spears and shields. They were ready to fight. But the plan wasn't about fighting. It was about trusting and doing what God said. Joshua's army went marching around the city, day after day after day. They're too scared to fight, the people in Jericho said. But they were wrong. God's people weren't scared. They were waiting for God to tell them what to do next. On the seventh day, God told his people to march around the city, not once, but 7 times. Then God told everyone to make as much noise as they could. Has anyone ever told you to make as much noise as you possibly can? Well, imagine that noise. Add 39,999 other people making that noise too, and you get the idea. Ear splitting. And as it turned out, stone splitting too, because the huge, strong walls of Jericho just crumbled to the ground as if they were made of sand. Jericho vanished in a great cloud of dust. So it was that God's people entered their new home. And they didn't have to fight to get in. They only had to walk. Joshua said, God has brought you safely here. Now, will you do what he says? Everyone said, "We promise." Only God can make your heart happy, Joshua said. So don't pray to pretend gods. No, they said, never. I'm afraid they didn't keep their promise. They didn't do what God said. And many years later, just as God warned them, things would go badly for God's people. They would lose their home. Enemies would capture them and take them off as slaves. And God's people would scatter into many different lands. But God's plan was still working. One day he would give his people another leader and another home. But this home, no one could ever take from them. So that was the story of Joshua and how he had to make sure that he listened to what God said. It was a very strange plan. He thought he was going to have to fight to capture the city. But no, God just wanted them to march, and then God did the important work. So that was the story all about Joshua. Now I'm going to read you another story about someone called David, and it's called The Teeny Weeny True King. God's people had a new land. Now they wanted a king. But God is your king, Samuel told them. He's the one who looks after you best. We want a real king, they said, one we can see. God knew that a king might not be kind to his people or look after them as well as he would, but God's people didn't care. They wanted a king and they wanted him now. So God gave them a king. He was called Saul, and he seemed like a good king at first, but he became proud and stopped listening to God. He didn't obey God or love God with his whole heart. Saul can't help me with my plan, God said. I need a king who loves me and will teach my people to love me. I need a true king. God had just the one in mind. Go to Bethlehem, God told Samuel. You'll find the new king there. Samuel's job was to listen to God and tell people what God said. So Samuel went to the little town of Bethlehem. God told Samuel to go to Jesse's house. God was going to choose one of Jesse's sons to be the new king. Jesse had 7 strong sons. Now in those days, if you were going to be the king, you didn't have to be the richest or the cleverest, although that was always nice. You had to look like a king, which meant you had to be the tallest and the strongest, so you could carry the longest swords and biggest armour and defeat everyone. And it didn't hurt to be handsome either. Samuel asked Jesse to bring him each son in turn. So Jesse brought the oldest, tallest, strongest son. This must be the new king, Samuel thought. He looks like a king. But God didn't choose him. You're thinking about what he looks like on the outside, God told Samuel, but I'm looking at his heart, what he's like on the inside. So Jesse showed Samuel his next oldest, tallest, strongest son. But God didn't choose him either. In fact, God didn't choose any of the 7 sons. Samuel said, "Is that all?" Jesse laughed. "Oh, well, there's the youngest one, but he's just the weakling of the family. He's only teeny." "Bring him," said Samuel. Jesse's youngest son came running up, and God spoke quietly to Samuel. "This is the one." His name was David. "He has a heart like mine," God said. "It is full of love. He will help me with my secret rescue plan, and one of his children's children's children will be the king, and that king will rule the world forever." Samuel anointed David's head with oil, which was a special way to show that you're God's chosen king. "You will be the new king one day," Samuel told him. And sure enough, when he grew up, David became king. God chose David to be king because God was getting his people ready for an even greater king who was coming. Once again, God would say, "Go to Bethlehem. You'll find the new king there." And there, one starry night in Bethlehem, in the town of David, 3 wise men would find him. This is the next part of the story of David, called The Young Hero and the Horrible Giant. This is probably one of the stories that you maybe know quite well. God's people had some scary enemies, but the Philistines were the scariest of them all. And now the Philistines had come to fight them. The Philistines had a secret weapon called Goliath. Goliath was a terrifying soldier, and worst of all, a giant. A giant so strong and so tall and so scary that no one had ever been able to fight him and live to tell the tale. So there they were, the Philistines standing on the top of the one hill, God's people standing on top of the other. Every day Goliath came out and shouted, "Send your best soldier to fight me. If he wins, we will be your slaves. But if I win, you will be our slaves." No one spoke. No one moved. "Chickens!" Goliath bellowed. "Your God can't save you. I'll rip your heads off and have you on toast." His beady, greedy eyes glared at them hungrily from under his horrible helmet, as if any minute he really might just gobble them all up. And he laughed his terrible laugh. Ha, 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 ha. It boomed, echoing horribly around and around the dry, dry valley. Well, Goliath might just as well have been a green slimy monster with 3 heads, because God's people froze with fear. Their eyes glazed over and they turned deathly pale. They knew if someone didn't do something quick, if someone didn't save them, but God would do something. He would send someone to save them. Now, you remember that David was the youngest son of Jesse? Well, his brothers were soldiers in the army. One day when David brought his brothers their lunches, he saw Goliath and he saw how scared everyone was. "Don't be afraid," David said. "I'll fight him for you." "You're only a little shepherd boy," the king said, "and Goliath is a great soldier. How will you fight him?" "God will help me," David said. So the king gave David his royal armour to wear, but it was too heavy and too big, and David couldn't even walk. "I won't need this," David said. Instead, David picked out 5 smooth stones from the stream. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Took his slingshot and walked towards Goliath. Step, step, step. Goliath walked towards David. Thud, thud, thud. "You?" Goliath peered down at the small boy. "I'm little," David shouted up to him, "but God is great." Goliath laughed an even terribler laugh than usual. Ha, 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 ha! It went. With just one swing of his giant sword, Goliath could finish the boy off. But David kept going. "It isn't how strong you are or how many swords and spears you have that will save you. It is God who saves you. This is God's battle, and God always wins his battles." David put a stone in his sling, swung it around and let it go. The little stone flew whiz like a bullet through the air and struck Goliath thud right between the eyes. Goliath stopped laughing. He stumbled and staggered and crash fell dead. When the Philistines saw Goliath was dead, they ran away. And when God's people saw them running away, they cheered. God had saved his people. David was a hero. Many years later, God would send his people another young hero to fight for them and to save them. But this hero would fight the greatest battle the world has ever known. So boys and girls, that was the story of David and Goliath. And the reason that I love that story is because it shows us that no matter how small you are, God can still use you for his plans. And all you have to do is say yes. So it doesn't matter how small you are, God can still use you to do amazing things. And I'm sure you could do amazing things for God too. So we're going to say bye-bye, and hopefully we will see you all again very soon. Do you want to say bye-bye?
Bye-bye.
Bye.